What if I told you that your fear of conflict is the real reason you feel stuck, unheard, and secretly resentful? That no matter how kind, patient, or agreeable you try to be, freedom keeps slipping through your fingers because you've mistaken peace for paralysis? See, Nietzsche didn't believe freedom came from avoiding chaos. He believed it came from walking straight into it, with eyes wide open. And yet, most of us are taught to fear confrontation like it's some kind of disease. But what if conflict isn't the enemy? What if it's actually the doorway to self-respect, power, and clarity? In this video, we're going to dismantle the lie that silence equals strength. We'll explore how Nietzsche's philosophy flips everything you thought you knew about courage, confrontation, and the role of discomfort in your evolution. And here's the kicker. By the end of this, you won't just understand the power of conflict, you'll crave the clarity it brings. So, stay with me. Because once you stop running from tension and start using it as a tool, that's when freedom becomes real. You probably know the feeling, biting your tongue in a conversation, smiling when you're fuming inside, or saying it's fine when it absolutely isn't. It might feel like you're keeping the peace, but here's the catch. Every time you dodge a conflict to stay safe, you're building yourself a psychological cage. Nietzsche would call this a form of self-imposed slavery, the kind that's invisible, but no less real. We think we're free because there's no one holding a whip, but in truth, we've outsourced the whip to our own fear of confrontation. See, conflict isn't the enemy, fear of it is. Avoiding conflict often comes disguised as maturity or diplomacy, but more often than not, it's just fear wearing a mask. We stay silent to avoid discomfort, to be liked, or to keep the waters calm. But the price of that silence? It's authenticity. The more you run from conflict, the further you drift from yourself. And the worst part? No one even knows what you sacrificed, because you've kept it all inside. Nietzsche believed that to live is to struggle, not necessarily with others, but with reality, with truth, and with your own weaknesses. The man who avoids conflict at all costs isn't peaceful. He's just suppressed. He hasn't escaped suffering. He's just chosen a quieter version of it. You may think you're choosing comfort, but you're actually choosing stagnation. Growth doesn't live in the land of passivity. It lives on the battlefield of tough conversations, hard choices, and standing your ground when it's easier to fold. So let me ask you this. What have you swallowed lately just to keep the peace? And more importantly, how long are you willing to keep swallowing your own truth before it poisons your sense of self? Don't answer just yet, because the moment you realize what Nietzsche really meant by freedom through confrontation, everything begins to shift. And the next step becomes impossible to ignore. Nietzsche didn't sugarcoat life. He didn't pretend that freedom was some spiritual high you could meditate your way into. For him, real freedom was a war, and the battlefield wasn't just outside you, but within. He believed that to liberate yourself, you had to first confront the parts of your personality that lie, that settle. The false self you construct to be liked, that's the first enemy. The outer world may chain your body, but it's your inner cowardice that chains your soul. He wrote often about the will to power, but people mistake it for domination. What Nietzsche really meant was the drive to overcome, especially to overcome yourself. That includes your fear of being disliked, your fear of failing, and yes, your fear of conflict. External battles are just echoes of the internal war. When you avoid confronting others, it's usually because you've already lost a negotiation with your own fear. Now, does this mean you should become aggressive or combative? Absolutely not. But it does mean you need to stop treating conflict like a plague. Instead, treat it like a forge, a place where your values, boundaries, and identity get tested and strengthened. Nietzsche saw conflict not as a detour from peace, but as the only real path to it. You don't earn clarity, purpose, or freedom without friction. They're all born in the fire. And here's the kicker. Until you make peace with the idea of confrontation, you'll never make peace with yourself. You'll keep second-guessing, self-censoring, and self-sabotaging. Nietzsche would say that's not living, that's performing. And performances may win applause, but they never produce freedom. Now, if you're wondering how this shows up in everyday life, wait until you see what happens when being nice becomes your worst prison. You've been taught since childhood that being nice is a virtue. Say please, say thank you, don't make waves. But here's what no one told you. When nice becomes your default mask, it slowly suffocates the real you. Nietzsche warned us against herd morality, the kind of moral code that keeps you obedient, pleasant, and small. People-pleasing might win you approval, but it costs you something far more precious: self-respect. Let's be real. You've nodded along in meetings when you disagreed. You've laughed at jokes that made your stomach turn. You've apologized when you did nothing wrong. All to avoid tension. But every time you betray your gut to please others, you chip away at your own identity. And eventually, you forget where the mask ends and you begin. Nietzsche would call this a life unlived, an echo instead of a voice. Here's the paradox: the more you try to be everything for everyone, the less you become anything to yourself. Niceness turns toxic when it's used to avoid friction. It robs you of the chance to express, to disagree, to assert. Conflict isn't evil. It's evidence that you're alive, engaged, and drawing boundaries. Nietzsche argued that the individual must resist the pressure to conform if they ever want to become who they truly are. That resistance? It starts with saying no. But I get it, saying no feels like rejection, like danger, like loss. That's exactly why it's powerful. People-pleasing is safe, but it's also silent. And silence, when it becomes habitual, becomes a slow form of self-erasure. So the question is, when you bite your tongue next time, will it be out of wisdom, or fear? Because soon we'll dive into what happens when that silence doesn't just hurt you, but empowers the very people who keep you small. Every time you swallow your truth to keep the peace, you're not just avoiding conflict, you're giving your power away. Nietzsche didn't believe oppression always wore chains and uniforms. Sometimes, it wears smiles, wedding rings, or job titles. And the scariest part? You often become your own warden. The fear of disappointing others, of rocking the boat, leads you to silence. But that silence? It doesn't protect you. It elevates the very forces that diminish you. There's a difference between choosing silence and being silenced. One is strategic, the other is submissive. Nietzsche warned us that most people aren't oppressed by tyrants, they're oppressed by their need to be accepted. Think about it. Who benefits when you keep quiet about what bothers you? Who thrives when you downplay your needs, ignore your instincts, or defer endlessly? Not you. And not the version of you who could have been bold, free, or even feared. Oppressors, whether manipulative bosses, controlling partners, or societal norms, aren't always monsters. Sometimes they're just people who realized you won't push back. And once they know you won't, they stop asking. They start expecting. What was once a favor becomes a duty. What was once a choice becomes an obligation. And the tragedy? You played a part in building the system that now holds you down. Nietzsche would say you've become complicit in your own unfreedom. So, if you've ever wondered why certain people take advantage of you again and again, maybe it's not because they're strong, but because you haven't made yourself hard enough to exploit. And that changes the game entirely. Because next, we'll talk about why conflict isn't just necessary, it's sacred. It's the crucible where the weak become strong, where the timid discover their edge, and it all begins with choosing to struggle. Nietzsche didn't believe in comfort, he believed in transformation. And transformation, my friend, never happens in cozy places. It happens in the friction zones, those moments of tension, discomfort, and yes, even conflict. While most people try to escape struggle, Nietzsche saw it as sacred, not because it's fun, but because it reveals who you are when nothing is easy. Avoiding conflict might make life smoother, but engaging with it, that's where evolution begins. You don't grow by agreeing with everyone. You grow by challenging and being challenged, by standing in the heat of confrontation and still holding on to your truth. The noble struggle isn't about fighting for the sake of it, it's about fighting for what's real. It's saying, I matter, my boundaries matter, my voice matters. That's not arrogance, that's self-respect forged in the fire of difficulty. Nietzsche would argue that only in these battles do we carve out the self. And sure, conflict will hurt. It might break relationships, shatter illusions, or leave you exposed. But pain isn't your enemy. Numbness is. When you avoid the noble struggle, you trade temporary discomfort for long-term regret. You become a polished version of someone else's expectations, a smooth stone that's been tumbled so much it has no edge left. But real power comes from keeping your edge. Conflict sharpens that. It refines you like a blade. So here's the twist. What if the tension you're avoiding is the very pressure that would unlock your next level? What if your growth isn't behind comfort, but behind the next hard conversation, the next boundary drawn, the next no said with conviction? Because up ahead, we'll explore a radical idea Nietzsche hinted at. What if peace is overrated, and being powerful is the real goal? Let's get something straight. Being peaceful isn't the same as being free. In fact, obsessing over peace, especially the performative kind, can be the fastest way to become weak. Nietzsche didn't admire the man who avoided conflict. He admired the one who could stand alone, misunderstood, and unshaken. Why? Because true power isn't found in applause. It's found in the quiet, unyielding courage to say, "You don't have to agree with me, but I won't betray myself." We're wired to seek harmony. But there's a difference between peace and passivity. The former is chosen. The latter is inherited from fear. When you live to be liked, you live in chains. Chains made of smiles, of compromise, of small talk that slowly chips away at your soul. Nietzsche believed the superior man wasn't afraid to walk alone in his truth, even when the world mocked or misjudged him. Especially then. Being misunderstood is the price of greatness. Ask any innovator, any trailblazer, any thinker who rattled the world. They were called arrogant, rude, cold, difficult. And yet, they pushed the world forward while the people-pleasers clapped politely from the sidelines. Nietzsche would say, "It's better to be hated for your strength than loved for your surrender." And guess what? Those who demand your silence are often terrified of what your voice might reveal. So the next time you're about to shrink yourself just to fit someone else's comfort zone, pause. That discomfort they feel, that tension in the air, it might mean you've finally stepped into your power. And as we go deeper, we'll stop looking outward for the conflict, and start turning inward, because the most exhausting war you'll ever face isn't with others, it's the one that brews silently inside your own mind. You can silence a room, out-argue your critics, draw boundaries with precision, and still lie awake at night, battling your own voice. That's the war Nietzsche believed was most crucial, the one within. Because until you confront your own fears, contradictions, and suppressed instincts, every external victory will feel hollow. Freedom isn't just walking away from toxic people. It's walking through the shadows of your own psyche without flinching. We all have that inner noise, the self-doubt, the guilt, the shame we pretend doesn't exist. But ignoring it doesn't make it vanish. It buries it deeper, where it festers and shows up in strange ways. Procrastination, burnout, bitterness, even niceness. Nietzsche didn't think repression made you good. He thought it made you weak. To be strong, you must dare to look inward and say, "What am I hiding from myself?" That question alone can change your life. Facing the war within isn't about self-loathing. It's about radical honesty. It's staring down your envy, your cowardice, your laziness, not to punish them, but to understand and integrate them. Nietzsche believed we are not made whole by denying our darker parts, but by mastering them. The man who makes peace with his own chaos becomes unshakable. He doesn't need to dominate others, he's already conquered the hardest battlefield of all. And here's where it gets interesting. Once you've faced yourself, something powerful happens. Your external conflicts lose their sting. You're no longer triggered by projection or hungry for validation. You respond, not react. And that is where true emotional power is born. But how do you carry that strength without becoming cold or aggressive? That's exactly where we're heading next, because not all battles are loud, and not all strength looks like war. You've been conditioned to think of conflict as something loud, raised voices, slammed doors, dramatic exits. But Nietzsche would tell you, the fiercest battles are often invisible. The most dangerous man in the room isn't the one yelling, it's the one who doesn't flinch. Real power doesn't explode, it holds. Mastery over your reactions isn't weakness, it's precision. It's the kind of control that signals strength so deep, it doesn't need to prove itself. Think about it. How many times have you said things you didn't mean in a moment of anger? How often has someone else's chaos pulled you into theirs? That's not power, that's surrender. Nietzsche believed that overcoming external enemies begins with mastering the inner reflex to overreact. When you stay calm in the face of provocation, you don't just protect your energy, you expose the instability of others. And that's leverage. This isn't about suppressing emotions, it's about channeling them. There's a difference between burying your feelings and bending them to your will. Silence, when chosen, not forced, is a weapon. Calm, when grounded in clarity, not fear, is magnetic. The man who refuses to be emotionally hijacked is rare, and therefore, powerful. Nietzsche called for a type of human who wasn't ruled by instinct, but who ruled it. That's the ideal we're aiming for. So the next time someone tries to bait you into chaos, remember, their noise is their weakness, your stillness is your strength. And once you master this, you gain the ability to draw a line, not in anger, but in conviction. Which brings us to something even more liberating, learning to assert your limits without guilt, shame, or hesitation. It's time to reclaim your voice. There comes a moment, usually after years of being agreeable, when something inside you snaps. Not out of rage, but realization. You've been shrinking, deferring, tolerating, and suddenly, you can't do it anymore. That's not a breakdown. That's a breakthrough. Nietzsche would say that reclaiming your voice isn't rebellion, it's remembrance. You're not becoming someone new. You're returning to the version of you that existed before the world taught you to stay quiet. Setting boundaries isn't rude. What's rude is expecting someone to bend over backward just to avoid upsetting others. When you set a boundary, you're not pushing people away, you're pulling yourself closer to the life you want. Nietzsche believed the highest form of strength was self-assertion, unshaken, unapologetic, and crystal clear. It's not about building walls, it's about drawing lines with respect, for yourself and others. But here's where most people stumble. They feel guilty, as if choosing themselves somehow harms everyone else. That's a lie society tells you to keep you compliant. Let me be blunt. If your boundaries offend someone, it's probably because they benefited from you having none. Nietzsche would call that dynamic parasitic, and the antidote is truth, not compromise. Speak it, stand by it, and let the chips fall where they may. And something beautiful happens when you start living this way. You stop waiting for permission. You stop explaining yourself. You start attracting people who respect clarity over comfort. Because the most powerful version of you doesn't yell, it simply refuses to be moved. And now, with your voice reclaimed, there's just one final shift left, understanding that conflict isn't the enemy of freedom, but the very soil in which it grows. Freedom. We talk about it like it's a destination, something waiting for us at the end of a quiet road. But Nietzsche had a different idea. For him, freedom wasn't found in stillness. It was forged in struggle. Not just external resistance, but inner clarity. You don't become free by escaping conflict. You become free by mastering it. By choosing when to engage, how to respond, and most importantly, who you refuse to be anymore. Most people confuse peace with avoidance, but the man who avoids all conflict is not free. He's just quiet in his cage. True freedom is noisy, not in volume, but in intensity. It says no without flinching. It confronts hypocrisy. It walks away when silence would mean surrender. Nietzsche believed that freedom was earned through fire, the fire of rejection, discomfort, and walking alone when no one else understands your path. This doesn't mean you pick fights. It means you stop running from them. You choose your battles with wisdom, but you stop apologizing for fighting them. You sharpen your mind, strengthen your values, and become someone who doesn't need validation to know they're right. Conflict isn't the opposite of love or respect. It's often the proof of it. It shows you're alive, engaged, and no longer willing to let life happen to you. So here's the truth Nietzsche dared us to accept. If you want real freedom, you must outgrow the fantasy of a life without resistance. You must become the kind of person who walks into tension with clarity, and leaves it with evolution. And now that you've seen what fear of conflict has cost you, the only question left is, are you ready to step into the fire and reclaim your power? Freedom doesn't arrive gift-wrapped. It's not something handed to you when you finally become nice enough or quiet enough. No, freedom is something you take when you stop negotiating with fear. Nietzsche never promised ease. He promised awakening. And that awakening begins when you stop running from conflict and start asking, what is this struggle trying to teach me about who I am? The question now is, how will you show up the next time tension rises? Will you shrink or stand? Will you soften your truth or sharpen your boundaries? Remember, every avoided confrontation is a step away from your freedom, and every chosen one, no matter how uncomfortable, is a step toward it. So here's your challenge. This week, choose one place in your life where you've been too quiet for too long. Speak, push, draw the line, not out of anger, but out of clarity. See how it changes you. Then come back and tell us in the comments what happened, because your journey might just unlock someone else's. If this message lit something in you, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, And share this with someone who's ready to break free too. We'll keep making videos like this, because the world needs more strong minds and unapologetic souls.